Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Simón Bolívar Part 6, All Good Things by Extra History. This is the last episode in Extra History series on Simón Bolívar. Now, in the last episode of this series, we saw Bolivar confronting some of the political problems facing Latin America following their independence from Spain. One of the biggest political problems facing them was the question of centralization or decentralization. There was a debate between people like Bolivar, who wanted one unified, centralized Latin American government, and those who would prefer a much more decentralized system where the different countries could be autonomous or even fully independent. At the end of last episode, Bolivar called a Congress to finally work this problem out. I guess we'll see what happened with that in this episode. Now, before we get into this one, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. With all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
All of Simon's hopes were pinned to his great conference. It was going to be like the Amphictyonic League that had once, centuries ago, brought all the Greeks together in a common confederation.
Will it be like
common
that?
Understanding of who they were.
Okay.
The most common phrase used...
You know, these sort of liberal enlightenment guys, they love their ancient classical history, right? They always wanted to be like the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans.
Today, to describe the Congress of Panama, is a resounding failure.
Things may not work out the way you expect.
Bolivar decided not to attend the Congress of Panama. Too many rumors were already circulating about him wanting to make himself a king, and he wanted to show that the Congress was completely free of his influence.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, there's two parts to this decision, right? One part is that he feared that his image was becoming that of an authoritarian, and he didn't want to be viewed that way. So part of this is, he doesn't want to appear that way. But I also think that he really didn't want to be that way. We've talked about it throughout this series. Bolivar took, several authoritarian decisions throughout this series. He was a bit of an authoritarian at times, and he certainly wanted power centralized in his own hands. But I tend to... there's different ways you could frame it. I tend to not see it as super nefarious. I really think he believed in the goals he was aiming for, and he really felt he was the best guy for the job. Now, of course, there's some ego involved in that, but I really think it was more than a simple power grab, though, that's all a part of this. So I do think one of the reasons he stayed away was that he legitimately, wanted independent political deliberation, free of his coercion or even, his sort of direct influence. I think he actually believed that. Though, once again, part of this is about, how does it appear, right? What is their perception? And I don't think he wants to be a tyrant. He also certainly doesn't want to be perceived as a tyrant. But, of course, the downside to this is if you're not there, that does actually limit your influence.
But unfortunately, Bolivar's influence was the only thing still holding this fragile idea of a Pan-American League together.
Right.
The Peruvians long felt that he had overstayed his welcome in their country, and they wanted nothing...
Right, the Peruvians, who, if we remember, tended to be a little more monarchist and conservative than some of their neighbors. Peru was really the last serious bastion of Spanish power in South America, so they're already a little bit separated from some of these other countries, especially Bolivar and his grand liberal ideas. We said this before, but yeah, this guy comes in and frees your country. That's great and all, but the longer he stays, the more problems start to arise.
To do with joining Gran Colombia. Brazil was a monarchy, and so wanted nothing to do with these fledgling republics.
Right, and of course, Brazil, that was a Portuguese colony. Brazil is actually it's got a fascinating history of its own. It took a bit of a different route than some of these Spanish colonies, so Brazil kind of has its own thing going on.
Argentina was terrified of being steamrolled by Gran Colombia, and so wanted nothing to do with the Congress in general. And the Bolivian delegates? They just didn't make it there in time. Worse still,
Damn.
Bolivar's vice president, Santander, the man he had left in charge of Gran Colombia, had now been running Gran Colombia for so long that he chafed at the idea of Bolivar reasserting himself over the country that he'd essentially abandoned.
Yeah, well, we've seen conflict between Santander and Bolivar before, and this really touches on the idea that Bolivar wants this unified, centralized system. And so, if you want that, people have ideological problems with that, but there's also the real question of power. You will come into conflict with the people who are currently ruling those countries you want to combine. So Santander already has a position of authority, and he doesn't want to see that authority eclipsed, and so you're going to get some issues here.
So even Santander was no help in forwarding Bolivar's cause at all.
They say even Santander, but like I said, they've had plenty of issues with each other. You know, there's also the classic, like, civilian politician versus military man split. You know, there were some issues. We saw that Santander was beginning to have a big issue with funding all of Bolivar's military expeditions in his army, so it's not really an even Santander. Like, nah, they'd had their fair share of problems.
But even as the Congress fell apart, more bad news was on the way. While he was still in Peru, a plot on Bolivar's life was uncovered. The plan was to kill Bolivar and expel all Colombians from the country, reasserting Peru as its own state.
Uh-oh.
Bolivar responded swiftly, exiling or executing those involved. But while history largely sees these sentences as justified, they did nothing to win him popularity in Peru. Then another misfortune struck. One of Bolivar's most trusted generals, Paez, the man who had led his cavalry, who had inspired the plainsmen, who had been instrumental in winning Bolivar the war, rebelled. But his rebellion was an odd one. He rebelled for Bolivar. He called for Venezuela to break from Gran Colombia and shake off the rules of Santander.
Yeah, we get, as with all revolutions, and frankly, politics is always like this, but especially when we're dealing with this revolutionary era of chaos and upheaval, politics is a complicated mess. I mean, you have an insane network of different alliances and rivalries and enemies and temporary alliances. I mean, you know, think about, like, the French Revolution, the complexity of that. And here we're dealing with several different countries. So, you know, you've also got a ton of complexity and it's just a very complicated political situation. Once again, there's immense complexity here that you're not nearly going to get into in a 10-minute video or a series of 6 10-minute videos. There's a lot to cover.
The vice president that Bolivar had left in Bogota. And so now Bolivar had both his general, Paez, and his vice president, Santander, begging for him to return with his army and help him crush the other guy, for the sake of the revolution. So Bolivar returned to Gran Colombia, not to take sides, but to heal the breach. And that he did, for a little while. Because even his enemies said that when they were with him, they could not help but love him. It was like a spell. The guy had charisma in spades.
Yeah, Bolivar, and we see some great men have this, some don't. You know, Bolivar, it's interesting, he was a controversial figure, even at the time. Although, I mean, he's very beloved today, don't get the wrong impression, among popular history. He's a very beloved figure, and overall, I think most would agree his accomplishments eclipsed perhaps the problems you might have with them. But he made some controversial decisions, and especially his ideas. A lot of people were not super on board with his political agenda, but he was this sort of magnanimous, unifying figure, and when he was around, he was able to unify people. Now, when he left, that's where the problems started to arrive. You can think of like a George Washington type figure, essentially. You know, someone who... I think George Washington was more like this than Bolivar. Washington was very good at sort of staying above the fray of petty politics. Not always. Don't get me wrong. Not always. But he was good at appearing like he was above the fray of petty politics. And people really felt like he was. And he really was a unifying figure for, you know, a lot of Americans. Bolivar had that, I think, to a lesser degree, but still had it. And I think it's to a lesser degree, one, because his sort of agenda was a little more controversial than Washington's. A lot of people didn't agree with it. And two, Bolivar And of course, I mean, hey, the United States could have ended up as a bunch of different countries. It didn't. But Bolivar is dealing with a situation that's going to end up in a bunch of independent countries, right? We're not going to end up with a United States of South America or whatever. And so he's got a more difficult situation to deal with in terms of unification in that respect than, say, Washington did.
All their grievances melted before his energy and open arms. But as soon as he was out of sight, all those enmities would spring up again. And his health was not what it once was. He was now gaunt, skeletal, eaten by consumption, the very disease that had taken his parents. But he was...
I mean, we think about George Washington, and of course there were the interests of each state to think about, but primarily there were sort of two factions he had to worry about, right? He had to negotiate the disagreements between these two factions, perhaps best represented by Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Those guys disagreed on a lot. Bolivar, he's got a bunch of different countries with their own interests and their own factions, both within and beyond the countries to deal with. That is like I said, sort of a much more difficult situation to unify.
Was never one to quit, and so he took back up the mantle of power in Gran Colombia. But his dictatorial ways isolated him more and more. And as he traveled the countryside, he saw the true effects of his revolution, of his republic. He saw a wasteland with roads destroyed, crops untended. The populace that he had freed were worse off now than when he'd stood outside of Rome so many years ago. And when he tried to do anything about it, he was met time and again with one unassailable fact. The country's treasury was empty. Santander had even negotiated a huge loan from the British to help keep the government afloat, but
that British intervention, especially in these Latin American revolutions, there was a lot of British involvement. It's just a little bit under the scenes usually, or behind the scenes, I should say. For a while, they didn't want to be seen as openly involved, but we're getting a little bit beyond that at this point, right? Spanish control has truly sort of disappeared. Is very much in the process of disappearing. So, and plus, you can look at a lot of times and places in modern history, and you'll find a lot of British financial intervention. They've always got some pounds to throw around.
That loan was already gone, under whispers of corruption and mismanagement. More even than corruption, though, there was one all-consuming source that had swallowed up the money. And that was the army.
Yeah.
For years now, Gran Colombia had essentially footed the bill for Bolivar to gallivant through Spanish America, liberate...
Yeah, we talked about this before. This was one of the big problems Santander had with Bolivar. Santander, civilian politician actually running the country, and Bolivar marching around with his army trying to free all of Latin America. Very noble goal, but of course, to Santander, he's saying, we're sinking all this money into your army that isn't even really helping us anymore. And remember, this is an era where we don't have the developed state apparatus that we do today, and there were some very complicated tax systems. But broadly, the state was bringing in a lot less tax money, income from taxes, than it does today. So a standing army was really a sort of monumental expense. Standing armies were starting to become more common in this era, but still, this was sort of a relatively new, controversial thing. And like I said, in this case, what's most important is that's something that costs a lot of money.
Country after country. Revolutions aren't cheap, and Gran Colombia had just paid for at least 6. Now the people of Gran Colombia strained against that yoke. But Bolivar, beset on all sides by news of military setbacks, felt that he couldn't shrink the military right now. Peru had not only broken from the Federation, but invaded what was to become Ecuador.
Oh.
Bolivia was in turmoil and close to being lost. There were even insurrections in the heart of Gran Colombia.
And yeah, revolutions are expensive, man. Look at Latin America, look at France, look at Haiti, look at Russia, 1970. I mean, you can think of any revolution you want. They're all the same. There are some exceptions, but I think of I think the American Revolution's an interesting example because that did cause economic chaos, right? That was really not good for the economy. Now, you could probably make an argument that the 13 colonies, the new states of the United States, made a better recovery. I think that probably is in part due to the relatively quick settlement with the British, and also the economic settlement, right? The fact that America was, of course, it was sort of removed from the British economic system, but it was sort of allowed to slide back into some of the economic positions it had once been in, not to mention the work of Alexander Hamilton. So, I think economically it managed to stabilize better than some other revolutions due to the nature of the revolution. But think of these Latin American colonies that have completely broken away from the Spanish Empire, which is very upsetty spaghetti with them, and now are breaking off into a bunch of different countries. That's still an extremely unstable situation. Think of the French Revolution, where you had revolutionary violence for years and years, and they straight up, overthrew the previous government, the monarchy, completely upended the economic situation, the financial situation, right? Most revolutions, it's very difficult to get the economy back in check when you're still dealing with a lot of political instability. Political instability, not good for the economy.
How could he risk reducing the army at this critical time? But it was the revolt of Peru that really tore a rift between Bolivar and his vice president, Santander. Santander practically cheered the loss of Peru. Not having to garrison such a large and querulous state would save the government a fortune.
Hey, he's like, let him go.
Bolivar saw Santander's reaction as a shot in the back. He saw Santander celebrating something which would ruin his grand project of a universal Spanish-American federation. He even began to suspect that Santander might have aided the rebellion.
Uh-oh.
Bolivar was in the field when he got the news about Peru. Tensions flared, and things escalated. Santander abrogated the dictatorial powers that Bolivar had been given, and in response, Bolivar, the champion of democracy, turned his army around and began to march on Bogota, the very first capital he had liberated. Surprisingly, when he got there, no blood was shed. An uneasy peace was formed, with the vice president still serving his office. But one thing...
Santander is not the most endearing character, I will say, but of course Bolivar sort of marching back into the country is a bad look. It's sort of a bad situation for both of them. Doesn't necessarily paint anybody in a good light, especially Bolivar, who's already worried about being viewed as a tyrant. He doesn't want to be viewed as some sort of military dictator. His actions often betray that intention, though, especially to the perception of a lot of the population. So it's like, even if Santander is getting up to no good, and often he was, when Bolivar responds, especially like that, a lot of people are not thrilled about that.
Was clear to Bolivar.
A lot of, especially if we're talking about the politicians of these different countries, they sort of feel like they've outmoded Bolivar. A lot of these civilian politicians, they say, okay, yeah, sure, Bolivar was a great military leader when we had the revolution was ongoing, but we've moved past that. We're doing civilian politics now. You should, liberator, go and retire and, have a nice fancy house or something. Leave us to our political affairs. But the thing is, Bolivar doesn't want to do that. He has a political agenda he wants to implement. He's extremely passionate about implementing. In fact, his idea of unification, the Federation, that was his whole goal in the first place. That's what he's been driving towards. And so he's not ready to give up, even though they would much rather, these civilian politicians, a lot of them, not all, of course, it's not like Bolivar had no allies, but a lot of them would rather he just sort of went away at this point and just left his legacy to rest.
The Constitution of Gran Colombia, one so different than the one he had pinned for his beloved Bolivia, was...
It's actually almost a little, in some ways, a little opposite of the George Washington situation, where Washington was like, all right, my job's done, I'm out of here. And everyone had to absolutely beg him to come back. He was like, I don't want to be president, I don't want to get involved in civilian politics. And they're like, please come back. We've got a bit of a, not exactly, obviously, a bit of a flipped situation here.
The problem. It kept getting in the way. It kept preventing him from doing what needed to be done. So he called for a great convention to rewrite the Constitution. But again, with his imperious march of the army against the capital of a country whose democracy he was supposed to defend, there were whispered charges of monarchism. Everyone said that Bolivar, like Napoleon, would try to give himself a crown. So Bolivar tried to remain hands-off.
Yeah, and if we remember from a previous episode in this series, Napoleon was, at one time, a great hero of Simón Bolívar's, until Napoleon went and crowned himself emperor, which Bolivar felt was a betrayal of his principles. And now, many people felt Bolivar was heading in the same direction. You gotta remember, a lot of people today, I think Bolivar probably gets the most comparisons to George Washington. I've been making him in this video. It's a pretty common comparison to make, partially because both were just such large figures of this era. But at the time, Bolivar was starting to get comparisons to Napoleon, who was a little closer in proximity in terms of time than Washington was. People were starting to think that Bolivar wasn't a Washington. He wasn't someone who was ready to win independence and then step back, though of course Washington was then called back. He was going to be a Bonaparte, someone who, from the perspective of critics, let ambition consume him, who betrayed his principles and crowned himself a monarch. Right, that is the critics' interpretation of Napoleon. He was more complex than that, but essentially that is what people were starting to say about Simón Bolívar. And so he loves a good convention. He's doing another Congress, a convention, and he says, okay, I'll be hands-off with this one, too. Okay, we saw how that went last time.
He wouldn't attend the convention. He didn't even seem to lobby that hard for anything other than the convention simply taking place. The voting for the delegates came in. Santander had campaigned vigorously, and his men were elected in a landslide. In the end, Bolivar only stayed in power because his delegates walked out, leaving the convention with one man less than the quorum they needed to hold.
So once again, it's tricky. Politics is tricky, man. Bolivar, it's like, and this is where I do sympathize with the man, and I don't see him as entirely nefarious. This is a man who wanted control. He wanted power. Like I said, sure, part of that is ego. Part of that is maybe desire for power. I think a lot of it was because he really believed in the goals he wanted to achieve. He wanted power. But I think he really didn't want to violently or coercively seize that power. I think we've seen several opportunities, several times when he had the chance, and he's refused. He's turned it down. Now, of course, if you're extremely cynical, you could argue, well, he just didn't want people to view him that way, and it wouldn't have worked anyway. I really do think that he didn't want to seize power that way. And so he's sort of left in a difficult situation where he really wants the power, because he thinks if he has that power, he can make things work. But he is unwilling to sort of take that step over the line, or at least over his moral line. So he's sort of left in kind of limbo, right? He's sort of hanging around. We've got these awkward situations where conflict occurs, erupts, but then it sort of simmers down a little bit, but it's always there under the surface. You know, it's a difficult situation for Bolivar.
Hold a vote. He was forced to sabotage the very convention he'd set up.
I mean, I think that, like, at this point, and before this point, he would have been better just leaving these countries to their own devices. I think it was pretty clear this wasn't working, and this wasn't going to work. I think you can criticize him for that, being too blindly committed to this one ideal. And I understand that he felt it was the way to go. It was sort of the one and only way to go. But like I said, I think it was pretty obvious at this point that it wasn't going to work, you know? So I do think that he probably should have taken a look around, slowed down, and stepped back. But of course, this is Simón Bolívar. You know, he's one of these guys that's never going to... That's like asking Napoleon to step back. These kind of people, that's not really what they do.
And in this moment, you get a sense of great sorrow. You see a man who recognized how far he had strayed from those ideals he lived for. But at the same time, you get a sense of a man who feels trapped, who feels compelled to take each individual action, even though each one is yet one more step away from his own desires.
Yep, I totally agree with that framing. I agree with that. I think that they put it fantastically. Like I said, there's a lot of different ways you could frame Bolivar. There's more negative and more positive interpretations, but I do feel it was something like this, that Bolivar was a man with ideals, with principles, but someone who felt like he had to keep doing these things to achieve his goals, but these actions he was taking were further and further away from some of those principles. And yeah, I think it is a conundrum, but like I said, I think Bolivar should have just laid off a little bit, because it just wasn't working, man.
And so, with the convention in tatters, Bolivar...
That's a very different man than a Napoleon, right? Let's be honest. This is a man who, in some ways, is seizing power, in some ways is not, but this is a very different man than a Napoleon never felt bad about seizing power. That's exactly what he wanted to do. he engineered everything so he could keep moving up through the ranks and claiming more and more power. Napoleon was generally a man who was not very conflicted about claiming higher and higher office. He felt, in fact, it was his destiny. And he was willing to do what it took and not feel too bad about it. That is not the man we're seeing here.
Once again took on complete dictatorial powers, abandoning all pretense of rule by republic. And the assassination attempts started to roll in. More than once he was saved by his mistress, but his list of friends and comrades had dwindled to a paltry few.
And we're also getting the classic, like, you become authoritarian, and then people try and assassinate you, because that's what people do to authoritarians, and in response you become more authoritarian, and, the cycle continues, right? It's not a good cycle.
Some had died in his wars, some had retired, done with public life, some he had alienated, and some, in the end, he had to put to the firing squad. Now one more from that list rebelled. The idea of a Latin American monarchy was pitched. And again, though he had not been directly connected with it, Bolivar was accused of looking to make himself king. With a heavy heart, one of his...
And I said this in one of the previous episodes, that, this was not such an uncommon idea. Now, in Latin America at this point, it's an extremely unpopular idea, but when we look at the United States following its revolution, some people, including, I'd say the most prominent of which was Alexander Hamilton, their idea was to create a government essentially modeled after Britain's and to have a president elected for life, aka essentially a monarch at the top of that government. And of course, that monarch would be George Washington, because everybody loved him so much. Now, that idea, though, a minority liked it, it was not popular amongst the majority, right? Most people would not stand for that sort of thing following the revolution. But it's not like it's an idea that came out of nowhere, right? That's the point I'm making here. That was an idea that was flying around even after some of these liberal revolutions. I mean, you can even look at the French Revolution, where, of course, they executed their king. But that was a couple years in. They didn't kill Louis immediately. Their first idea was to create a more democratic government with the king still in the executive position. And so it's not super surprising you have people who want to do that here. It's just, in this time and place, especially with all these fears about Bolivar becoming a tyrant, it's very much not an acceptable idea to most.
Loyalist generals decided that there would be no peace for the nation so long as there was Bolivar. And so, once again, Bolivar picked up the sword. Where once he had spent hours in the saddle, he could now only spend an hour or two at a time before he was racked with coughing. But though well past the vigor of his youth, eaten from the inside out by consumption, Bolivar still remained active, trying to manage the military and the affairs of states. But as another former friend met his death before his armies on the battlefield, Bolivar knew time was up. His health was failing. He would not live much longer. Of this he was acutely aware. He was reduced to ruin, declared an enemy in many of the states that he'd helped to free, and even banned from much of Venezuela, his homeland. His great dream was crumbling around him.
Bolivar was left at the end of his life sort of politically unpopular, ill, and frankly destitute. To my understanding, he was someone who, I think this is another point in his favor, was really not interested in corruption. This was someone who really did not make an effort to personally enrich himself throughout the course of his career, which is admirable. It also meant, because he was so politically unpopular, he was struggling to find allies, he was left with virtually nothing by the end of his career, apart from, his name, his legacy, which at this point was beginning to be sort of shredded. Now, very different from where we stand today. His legacy is very strong, and I think we'll talk about that at the end of this video, but Bolivar was really a man who was left with very little at the end of his life.
One by one, all the states of Spanish America were abandoning his great project. Gran Colombia was disintegrating around him, and there was nothing he could do, frail skeleton of a man that he'd become. So, one last time, he tried to put affairs in order, to leave some part of the world that he tried to free ready for a world without him.
Wow, look at that.
To leave...
Look at that wonderfully drawn map. I've never seen such an accurate depiction of South America.
with some part of
Oh,
the world
man.
that he tried to free ready for a world without him. He called together all the notable men of the revolution that were left and asked them to oversee the transition of power, to help keep the country together while he retired quietly back to Europe, which he had not seen since his youth. But even this was not to be. The government wouldn't let him go until new elections were held, and he was destitute. He sold his silverware in order to try to afford the trip. When the new elections were held, the man that he'd asked...
Like I said, once again, not great that he was left broke, but a credit to him, he was not interested in personally enriching himself. This isn't a case of, like, someone like a Thomas Jefferson, right? That man had a lot of material wealth, but he was left broke due to all his debt by the end of his life. I think mostly because he was a bad manager of money in his estate. That wasn't Bolivar. It wasn't that Bolivar was bad at managing his estate. I mean, his estates had been stripped from him earlier in life. This was a man that, well, maybe he wasn't great at managing his affairs, right? Maybe he would have been a little better off. But it really was that this was a man who just wasn't interested in personally enriching himself, didn't focus much on it, and thus was left with very little.
all those great nobles to let be his successor, didn't win. And so Bolivar slunk out of Bogota to make the arduous trip to Cartagena. But even the very ship he was to leave on ran aground, and so he sat, exiled in his own homeland, slowly wasting away like the nations he'd founded. After one last short trip, he died. Not on the battlefield, not with fanfare or ceremony, but of a lung rotting from the inside out. He had not left behind order. He had not left behind a single unified state. He had not left behind a lasting constitution or an enlightened code of laws. But he had left behind liberty. He was the Libertador.
Wow. Yeah, it's a very bittersweet ending, I will say. I do want to put a few things into perspective. And we're at the end of the series, so it's time to talk about the legacy of Simón Bolívar. It's interesting. This story, it's a very bittersweet one, right? It's one with a lot of ups and downs. It's of a man who achieved so much, but at the end of his life really struggled to live up to his principles and failed to achieve what he wanted. He did the first step. He gained independence for the countries of Latin America, but he failed to create that unified... Well, he did, but it fell apart, right? In the end, he didn't get what he wanted. Look at Latin America today. You've got a bunch of independent countries, not one mega-state. But if we think of how Bolivar's remembered today, he's remembered as the liberator. His legacy is an extremely positive one. He is one of those mythologized figures like a George Washington, for example. For many Latin American countries, he is remembered, like I said, as the liberator, this great mythologized, perfect figure who could do no wrong, who freed them from oppression, and only the good parts are remembered in many cases. So, his legacy is pretty strong today. I wouldn't, I guess his life ended in not such a great way. It's not like he can see how he's remembered today. But if we're talking about the legacy of Simón Bolívar, that has gotten only stronger and stronger over time. Now, I don't know. That's a sort of general statement. I didn't go to school in any Latin American countries, so I don't know how he's actually taught in these classrooms, but that's sort of how I learned of him as, right? I went to school in the United States, and we learned of him as a very positive figure, a liberator, a freedom fighter. That is what he is remembered as, and a lot of the controversy is contained to the history books, which a lot of people don't read. I know we enjoy history here, but most people are not that engaged. They get sort of the surface level, and that is the surface level of Simón Bolívar's legacy. Interesting. Sort of a bit of a bittersweet life, but a legacy that remains very strong and very positive today. And I think if we look at the entirety of his life, I think his achievements absolutely outweigh, the problems with his career, right? He was really the central figure in freeing a lot of these countries, fighting for their independence. I think, his political agenda following those wars didn't really work out, but it's still, frankly, an incredible achievement that he managed to do what he did. And once again, you can sort of frame him as a power-hungry authoritarian figure. And on one hand, there's some merit to that, but I do tend to take a more sympathetic view of Bolivar, of a man who sort of took steps he didn't want to in order to achieve a goal he sort of felt was necessary. Now, doesn't necessarily justify everything he did, and of course it didn't work out in the end, but like I said, I sympathize with him, and I think he achieved great things. So yeah, that's my bit on the legacy and life of Simón Bolívar. I'm interested what you guys have to say, especially if you're from one of these countries that Bolivar helped to free. What you think of him, what his legacy sort of is today. So yeah, I had a good time with this series. I always love talking about this time period. I love the good late 1700s, early 1800s. That is like my era of history. That's what I sort of know the most about, what I'm most interested in. Though I really love all history, right? Anyway, this was a good one. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I certainly did. And if you did enjoy it, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. With all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.